Ferrari at breakfast. Call 0345 6060 973.
10 minutes before 8. I'm sorry I've not been able to get more of your calls concerning the horrors in Texas, the massacre of the innocents. I promise I will, and we will continue coverage of that, of course, through the whole of the show. But let's come back to domestic affairs, and you don't need to be told that any way to encourage investment into this country is to be applauded. So, what of legislation, I understand, is on the way that seeks to make this country the best on the planet to invest in agri-food research and innovation. More now from Conservative MP and Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Secretary George Eustice, who joins me. Just explain, let's back up a little if we could, Secretary of State, agri-food research and innovation in terms that my listeners will understand as they're buttering their toast and putting milk on the cornflakes. What does that actually mean? Good morning.
Good morning. Well, the reality is that the UK's always been a world leader in areas such as plant breeding and agricultural technology. We've got centres in England like Rothamsted and the James Hutton Institute in Scotland that are world leaders in their fields. What we're announcing today is a change in legislation that unpicks basically a bit of a rogue court judgment from the European Court in 2018, and that deemed that what's called precision breeding technologies, where you can actually take certain traits from maybe one variety of wheat and put it into another variety of wheat, they held that should be treated like genetic modification. When actually it's very different, because genetic modification means taking a gene from one species and taking it across species boundaries. So we're making it easier.
You've anticipated my question, Secretary. This isn't GM crops. This isn't Frankenstein food or mutant crops or whatever it might be. That's not what we're seeking. Just to clarify, Secretary of State.
Exactly. So it's not GM's food, but there was a court judgment in the EU that held that these precision breeding techniques, which basically do in a more targeted way what's always been done by plant breeders down the centuries, trying to identify traits and naturally trying to breed them into a plant, whether that's high yields or resistance to disease. It enables us to do that in a much more targeted, precise way. But it doesn't do anything that couldn't occur naturally, and that's what makes it different. And if we want to reduce our use of pesticides, for instance, and we want to help the environment by having fewer fertilizer inputs with all of the impact that has on water quality and climate change, it's going to be quite important that we breed plants that are more resistant to disease and better able to resist drought, for instance, and we can do that with this technology.
Lastly, do you sense there are companies around the world queuing up to come into the UK and to invest in this area? Are you confident that this is going to be worth the time, effort that you and your colleagues are putting in?
I am, yes. So there are companies in Europe that are looking to relocate some of their operations to the UK. Some of them already have bases here, but they're very interested in being able to do this sort of precision plant breeding. And there will be other companies around the world that will be seeking to benefit really from the academic centres of excellence we've got in the UK.
Can we come to some other matters? Reminding my listeners, you're the MP for Cambourne and Redruth, an area that I'm sure depends a lot on railway and provision of railway lines. The strike vote, you'll know, came in yesterday. There are dark mutterings of strike action this summer, Secretary of State, where rail workers could only provide service for 12 hours a day, 7 a.m. through 7 p.m. Your reaction to that and your reaction to the strike vote?
Well, I think, it's a mistake. And obviously there are lots of different votes that are taking place because, different franchise operators have each had their own votes. But I think they've jumped the gun slightly. There are still, plans that we are working on to try and reform the way elements of the railways work. The truth is now we've got things like ticket offices in many parts of the country have started to become, redundant and underused because people are buying online or they're using contactless cards now. We need to recognise that technology's changed some of that. And if we want to keep, rail fares down, we do need to have some reforms. And technology can also help with rail safety in terms of more accurately inspecting rails, for instance, to make sure there aren't any problems. And we've got to be willing to be open to some of those changes and reforms. I know that Grant Shapps is going to want to work constructively, with the unions and with workforces on this. But I think this ballot on a strike action is probably premature because there's still discussions that are taking place.
The unions want an 11% pay rise, Secretary of State. How do you respond to that?
Well, it's important to note that drivers for those working on or pay for those working on the railways is often higher than in many other walks of life. So, a train driver at the moment will usually get around £59,000 per year. They've seen some rises in their salaries during the last decade when others haven't really. So, we've got to show some restraints on public sector pay, and the railways are no different in that matter. During the pandemic, there had to be a huge government subsidy to keep the railway network going. And as we come out of the pandemic, we've now got to sort of work on making sure it's viable and we've got the right reforms in place.
Well, also, of course, inflation is eating into the pay packets of the rail workers, indeed all of us for that matter, so we need some kind of assistance. It is reported that your colleague Rishi Sunak will announce billions of pounds of aid, as it comes up reported that we might be looking at a price cap of £2,800 come this autumn. When will the relief package be announced? Do you know, Mr. Eustice?
Well, I don't know, but what I would say is Rishi Sunak has always been clear that he's going to keep this under close review. So he announced a package of measures in the spring when the first price cap rise came, with a £150 rebate on council tax and another £200 to dampen. Well, that was a non-repayable element. The £200 was a loan, if you like, but it dampened the rise for this year. He always made clear that he would look at other interventions and measures, at the right time when they became necessary. Obviously, now we're seeing that price cap rise again in October. And so rightly, he's giving some thought as to how he can help people during that difficult time. We're treading a very difficult path here, because if we just borrow lots more money and throw it at this situation, we could compound inflation. We could make the situation worse and see prices rise further. So we've got to try and dampen that inflation, and that means showing some restraint, but equally helping people, particularly those on the lowest incomes, who will struggle with some of these price rises.
Do you imagine we'll hear more this week from Mr. Sunak?
Well, look, my understanding is that he is looking at things, and we may hear more this week. But I'm afraid I haven't got a precise timing on that or what he might say. But I think he's been clear that he's always been open to doing more, and he's giving some consideration as to what more he might do.
We do seem to have timing on the Sue Gray report, which we understand will be published at some point today. How much nervousness is there within Number 10 and senior ranks of government, Secretary of State?
Well, look, there's speculation that it's today. My understanding is it'll probably be this week, but I'm also, people are now saying today looks likely. Obviously, it'll be for Sue Gray to decide, precisely when that's published. But look, I think that the thing is, it's not so much nervousness. There's, the Prime Minister, obviously feels, deep regret about what's happened. He's apologised for what happened. He paid the fixed penalty notice for the birthday event that he was at, that a cake was brought in at. He's absolutely made clear that he understands people's anger about this and that changes are going to need to be made. Sue Gray's interim report concluded that there were failings at many different management levels within Number 10, and that actually there was a blurring of the boundary between what was work and maybe a send-off for a leaving member of staff at the end of a working day, and clearly what became parties in many instances, and the police have done a thorough investigation.
If more pictures were to emerge of the Prime Minister availing themselves of drink or giving toast to colleagues, how difficult would you find it to continue to defend him?
Well, look, he himself, has expressed deep regret about what's happened. What we are seeing over the last couple of days is obviously some additional photographs, but I don't think we're really seeing anything that's particularly new in terms of the fact that we knew that these events had happened. There was a big controversy about it. Sue Gray's run an independent inquiry to it, and the police have run a very detailed investigation into each of these events and issued many fixed penalty notices. So it may be that we don't discover much new, but obviously what we'll be looking at in Sue Gray's report is what recommendations she might make so that we can ensure, that this matter can really be, put behind us and dealt with and changes made.
Noting the year of your birth, how much do you remember of the 1970s? I ask you that because, of course, the Prime Minister, I understand, asked you and all your cabinet colleagues how much all of you recall of the 1970s. He perhaps thinks he's surrounded by young whippersnappers. What do you remember of those troubled times, Mr. Eustice?
Well, I do remember. I remember, actually, Margaret Thatcher winning that 79 election, and And James Callaghan's, I remember him giving a speech where he said it would be nice to spend more time with his grandchildren, I think. And so it's so weird how things like that stick in your mind. Obviously, I would.
For those of us who were doing our homework by candlelight, though, and were battling with inflation, I don't know that you're quite in tune with that, are you, Mr. Eustice?
I don't recall it. During the 70s, I was 7 or 8, and actually preoccupied with things that were much more fun than dealing with the winter of discontent. But obviously, it was talked about for many years, well into my teenage years, and so an understanding of that, the dangers of inflation. And again, in the 70s, it was driven by a rise in gas prices and oil prices. That's what sparked it.
Yes.
And then there was wage inflation. So there were some similarities. And yes, it took many, many years to get all of that back under control, and it was quite painful to do it.
Last minute with you. You upset some folk a few weeks ago when you suggested families could look to buy value products, own brand products perhaps, over Heinz or Kellogg's or whatever it might be. Do you regret saying that? And have you yourself been purchasing those value brands?
Well, on the latter point, yes, I do sometimes buy those value brands, and well, I don't regret it because actually I wasn't telling anyone. It's very important in this. I wasn't lecturing or telling anyone what they should do, and I always say on these things, people should watch the whole interview rather than look at the Twitter argument about it, because social media often doesn't put things in the correct light. What I was pointing out is that last time we had this price spike in 2008, what actually happened is that household spending on food didn't rise by as much as food prices, and that's because people did change their shopping habits. They bought different items, and in some cases, yes, they down traded to some of the value brands, and that's just an observational comment. It's what some families did in 2008, and it is what people will be doing now.
And what you're doing. So you'd know the price of a tin of Asda baked beans in tomato sauce.
Well, I don't buy them at Asda, but I
own brand.
sometimes get own brand. In everyone's, well, it depends on the size of the tin, but
regular
it can
tin,
be
405 grams, 405 grams.
I think it's about 80 pence.
25 at Asda. George Eustice, thank you very much for your time. Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Secretary, appearing here on LBC. 2 minutes after 8 News is next.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, at least 19 children and 2 adults have been killed in a shooting at a primary school